Latina show.
Hosted by IDM.
And we are not alive. How are you doing, Nina, today?
Hi, Marcelo. I am very caffeinated, very sleep deprived, which means I'm ready to go because that's my usual state. Welcome to season 2. I get to say season 2 of the Winter Latina show, where we discuss politics, geopolitics, international relations, history, and of course, culture. And today we have a very special guest who was on our show last year. It seems like it's been just a little while, but I think it's been more than 6 months. This is Dr. Karin Kneissl, who is an Austrian diplomat, academic, and journalist. She's the former federal minister for European and International Affairs of the Republic of Austria. Dr. Kneissl specializes in a number of issues and realms and fields ranging from international relations to the field of energy. She currently resides in Russia, and she's the head of the Gorky Center in St. Petersburg. And Gorky is an abbreviation and stands for Geopolitical Observatory for Russia's Key Issues. Marcelo, please, let's bring our guest on.
Without further ado,
Dr. Kneissl, please introduce yourself. Let me know if there's anything that I'm missing, any new projects you might have been working on recently.
Good evening, Nina. Good evening, Marcelo. Good evening to all you. Fine. No, you did a marvelous sum up of my current state. Maybe I would only drop the adverb that you put in. She's currently residing in Russia, because I do hope from the bottom of my heart, from the bottom of my heart, that it's not a temporary residence. Even though formally speaking, I'm here with the political refugee. I have a working visa. And I have a residence permit for 1 year, which I just renewed, which is really a tough bureaucratic adventure. But against all odds, my plan, I hope it works, is not to be just temporary resident, but to be here for good. And the last time we had the pleasure of a conversation, I was still living in St. Petersburg, where my office is, which I started with a tiny but very fine group of colleagues. We founded that geopolitical observatory that you just very well described. And I was in an apartment in St. Petersburg. I remember very well. It was a hot evening, very sunny evening. And St. Petersburg for me was necessary. The first 11 months, I really worked day and night to get everything on track. But my idea was always to teach more in the regions, because students in the regions are, if I may say, much more hungry and thirsty. They are much more motivated. I don't want to generalize and say, well, St. Petersburg University students are not so motivated, but after 16 months of teaching really across the country, from Veliki Novgorod in the north to the Ural, Yekaterinburg, to Tomsk, Omsk, Khabarovsk, Vladivostok. I've been in many universities, and in some of them twice, 3 times. Really, I prefer teaching in the regions. For me, it's more rewarding. I don't do it because I heard the other day St. Petersburg University professor say, yeah, they also merit to have some good teachers. It's so arrogant. I don't know. It's honestly, for me, it's much more rewarding to have motivated and, as I say, literally thirsty and hungry youngsters who are eager to improve and to move on. So this is the situation. And I was still in St. Petersburg. I worked day and night to get everything on track. Our institute now works. It doesn't require my daily presence there. And I moved into the countryside. I had already found by then a little village I moved into the village physically with a trailer full of my animals in July. And I'm renovating here in Ryazan Oblast, which is the oblast most people usually connect with the national poet Yesenin. Sergei Yesenin. It's a beautiful region where the plains meet the woods. And when I step out of the house and I go to the left, I'm in the woods. When I go to the right, I'm in the plain, in the fields. It's marvelous. And so I'm here in a village of 270 souls. We have a little school with 48 pupils. And by the way, we are also the native village, and I feel really very much connected already to the village. So I say we. Our village is also the place where the Soviet cosmonaut Vladimir Viktorovich Aksionov was born. And he's not as famous as Yuri Gagarin, maybe. He's not as internationally known. I didn't know him personally, but I still had the pleasure to meet him last year. Today we had a very nice commemoration festivity in the school because he would have turned 90. Unfortunately, he passed away last year. Yes, so I'm living in the village. We built here a tiny wooden house, and I'm renovating an old ruin, which I found, which had no roof, no windows, nothing. It's from the 1830s. And everybody told me, you're crazy, you should build something new. I said, no, I want to renovate this. And we are renovating. And it moves on, it's advancing. So this is the situation. This is, if you want, the main project. But of course, in order to finance all that, I work as much as I can by writing, teaching, and I am again reiterating, not currently residing, because I do all that not for a temporary residence. I do it really to continue living here and to be part of Russian life. The main problem continues to be the language. Luckily, I can work in English because I could not teach in Russian. Sometimes I work in French, but mostly it's English. And my Russian is improving thanks to the fact that I live in the village now. And so I pick up a lot, and luckily some of the children are correcting me. I always ask them to correct me, and for them it's easier than for adults maybe to say you shouldn't say this, you should say it that way. And my little four-legged company is increasing next to my two boxers who have been joining me across the planet, I can say, all the last 7 years. There is now a little abandoned King Charles. I had one King Charles Cavalier Spaniel before, and I could not afford a third boxer because it's too much to walk 3 boxers. I also did that, but I can walk, I think, the 2 boxers and this little thing. Plus, to my 2 cats, there are another 2 cats that joined, 2 ponies, and I have again chicken and ducks and even peacocks. So this is the situation.
It sounds amazing being in the countryside with animals, but as you said, there is a language barrier. How do you find the reception coming from this very small locale in Russia? How do they perceive you? It sounds like children are very comfortable with you if they're correcting you already, but what is their perception? How do you get along with everyone?
Well, certainly I'm an alien in the village, and I will always be an alien in this village. I've been most of my life in villages, also as a child. We lived in northern Germany in a small village, and we were also aliens there because my father was a pilot and not a farmer. He went to go to work to Spain in the morning and come back in the evening, and the others went into the fields. That was in the early 1970s, so we also were aliens there. And I lived in many villages where I tried to integrate myself as much as I could, but I was always aware of the limits. And of course, coming here as the ex-foreign minister of Austria with the very fixed perception people have of me, of course, I'm an alien. But people are very, very kind, very warm-hearted. Not only the village, it's all over. It's also in the big cities. It's at railway stations. It's the case in any public transport I take it. So it's really it's people are simply open-minded, and I have had only maybe one slightly tough encounter. That was the only one in 16, 17 months. I couldn't say that if I were living now in Germany, Austria, you encounter at least one nasty person per day. This is not the situation here in Russia. And what is most impressive for me, honestly, is given the current geopolitical situation in which Russia is, the cancellation of Russian culture, especially by the Germans and Austrians, this Russophobia, that given all that, when people hear me speak German or hear that I have a foreign accent, that I'm not really very firm in Russian, they smile and they immediately help, and they would say, oh, I also learned once upon a time German. So there's a totally different approach than what you have on the other side of the line, where Russia is just cancelled. Yeah, we know this unfortunate term, and it goes beyond politics. It goes beyond business. It goes into sports. You are not anymore supposed to listen to Russian music. Instead of doing Tchaikovsky evenings in Vienna, they would do Chopin evenings, and paintings which were called, I don't know, Russian farm women are now Ukrainian farm women, etc., etc. So we know all that, and Russians are warm-hearted, and I may really generalize that because this is the way I have been living it for the last 18 months, and I didn't know anything about it because my interest of work and personal interest was always the region which I call West Asia, Middle East, the Arab world, Iran, especially Lebanon, Syria, where I lived for a while and where I was teaching for many, many years. So I find my way around in Tehran, in Beirut, Damascus. This is the mentality I think I know. And Planet Russia, as I always call it, was a totally new universe. And it's interesting that even so, we are so close, and I have every day, I have the impression that I'm living parts of my childhood in terms of certain food, in terms of certain gestures, traditions. It reminds me a lot of the 1970s, 80s in Vienna. And on the other hand, it's a new planet for me to discover. And it's very refreshing on the one hand, if you want to take it from a positive note, but it's also very exhausting because I am starting everything from the scratch. And of course, it's not easy. I don't want to say everything is given. Nothing is given. For everything you have to work. I have to queue up at least once a week for some paper, for something, And I have no special treatment. I have no, I don't know, people still think that things are served on a silver plate. For me, it's not the case. I work hard for it. And if I had not here the support of one mayor who helps me a lot with all this bureaucracy, I could never do it without him. And he himself always says it's impossible to do it. He himself doesn't get it. But we queue up together to get this paper and that paper. And in St. Petersburg, thank God, I have one university professor colleague who really made it happen that I could come, because there was a lot of empty announcements by the university. Nothing happened. And then this very colleague, Victor, he took things into his hands. And that's how I came, because I often get mails from people who would like to emigrate to Russia. And then they point out this presidential decree of bringing people with traditional values, etc. Nice words, but there are no structures for all that. It's impossible. It's mission impossible if you don't have somebody who takes you by the hand and say, we queue up here, we queue up there, you have to do now this examination and that paper. And this is really, really tough. So if they want to attract people to come, they have to change the system.
Thank you for explaining that. We had another foreigner who immigrated to Russia from the US, and he kind of had a similar experience in terms of describing the bureaucracy, and he eventually ended up getting Russian citizenship. So it sounds like it is something that needs to be clarified a little bit. I did see the same announcement about attracting people with, so-called traditional values, but I didn't see, as exactly as you said, the structure, the practical parameters for what that would entail. And it sounds like it's something that needs to be developed a lot more. I'm glad that at least on a person-to-person level, it sounds very optimistic that people can be sort of outside of politics and interpret you as a human being, as opposed to someone with a particular biography coming from a specific country. So let's jump into your professional life right now. If you can explain what the Institute does, and when you're traveling to these different cities and the regions, whether you're lecturing as part of the Institute, whether these are individual assignments, and just your general impressions of the academic life. You said these regional students are more hungry for education, which is really interesting. If you could also clarify what you mean by regions. Are you referring to anything outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, or what does that mean?
Yeah. Well, when I speak of regions in French or in German, you would say in the provinces, but I prefer, and I think it's also the Russian terminology, to speak about the regions, the oblast. And it's really anything outside of St. Petersburg and Moscow. For instance, one university with which we are as the Gorky, and it's always on behalf of the Gorky. I don't do it in my personal name. I come there as the Gorky, and the Gorky, it's two colleagues and me. We are really not a big thing, but we can relate to different colleagues at the university, and we have already really entered into very, very good working relations with various other institutes, mostly universities. And this is how we get things done. I'm not a big fan of huge structures. The smaller, the better. So if you have 3-4 committed people, you can get things done. If you have 50 non-committed people, you get stuck. I've seen both of it. So anything outside of St. Petersburg, let me take, for instance, Veliki Novgorod. It's located on the map. It's about 150 kilometers south of St. Petersburg. And it's actually the oldest capital of Russia. It's there where Rurik dynasty started, the Russian Slavic kingdom. And it's a very interesting old, truly Russian history capital. I mean, you feel the 9th, 10th, 11th century of Russian history there in every step. The very old Kremlin that is there, and Kremlin, for those who are not familiar with the notion, it just means fortress. It's the one. It's this encirclement actually of settlement. And at the University of Veliki Novgorod, which is named after Saint Yaroslav, the Wise One, I lecture. And also there, which is only 150 kilometers from St. Petersburg, but it's already a different atmosphere. And also in that university, which is a small place, so to say, in the province, if you want, it might become even the periphery of St. Petersburg if this urbanization goes on like this. But you will find a really interesting number of international students coming from North Africa, Southern Asia, very, very high number of young people who go into engineering, artificial intelligence. They have a lot of education and research in that university. But I've also been, for instance, to Krasnoyarsk, which is right in the middle of Siberia. It's actually together with Kemerov, the capital of Siberia. And also interesting to be there and see and feel how students also there still have a very romantic, I may say, illusion of what Europe is, of what the West is. Amazing number of French-styled restaurants you will find in Krasnoyarsk. Whenever I asked for Russian food, I got French food. And they told me there's no demand so much for Russian food. Whenever I asked for Russian champagne, they gave me French champagne. So that was my 3-day experience in Krasnoyarsk. But yes, it's when I speak of the region, it's really everything outside of St. Petersburg and Moscow. And this is maybe also the reason why I'm living in a village. I'm definitely not a city person. I never was. And for many Russians who I know, who know me a little bit better, whom I met already a few years ago. I haven't known any Russian 5 years ago, but over the last 6-7 years ago, I would say knowing in a personal, private way. And some of them feel even a little bit insulted that I moved to the village. You know, those from St. Petersburg, they just can't believe it. How can she move to a village? And the village for me is, if I may say, much more Russia. It's like the French village is much advanced than Paris is, and it's easier, of course, to live in a French village. But just to put things a little bit into some structure for our guests who listen to us, internet here in the village is fantastic. And this
I
is
was
really
about to say that.
thank you very much. It's much better than at St. Petersburg State University, where whenever I do my podcasts, live interviews, it's interrupted all the time. It's like that. While we have very good internet, thank you very much, Marcelo. And we
Because on my side, that was the first thing that when you start saying that you're living in a village with 250 people, I was like, and the internet is amazing there. While
yeah,
if I go 2 kilometers from where I live, it's
yeah.
impossible.
No, and I'm really here in a very small village, which takes, if the traffic is good, 5 hours to Moscow. So it's not suburbia. It's not the place to be. You know, it's not a chic place. It's not with a name that people would move to. You have these places also in Russia, like where there's Sustal, there's Vladimir More to the north here, which have become a little bit chic over the last few years. So people have their Dutchess there. This is a no-name place where I am. And good internet, drink water from the tap, precious water, very fresh air. And I don't underestimate that ever since I know now Moscow with air. No traffic jams. So there are lots of pros on all that. Plus, what functions in Russia marvelously well is the Russian response to Amazon. You know, it's the Stavka service, the delivery things. If I need a special type of medicine, if I need a special type of food for my dogs or anything, I can order it and I can pick it up 15 minutes from here. So it's not like I have now to go to the city and then travel back with 2 suitcases because I have to bring things from the city. No. It's all fine. And I say that because there's, in addition to all this Russophobia and this cancellation of Russia, of course, there is this very weird perception like, yeah, there's Moscow, and in Moscow maybe you have doctors and schools, but outside of Moscow you have nothing, and people have no toilets, and I don't know what nonsense you read wherever, or people would say. Well, we are living a very, very good life here in the Russian countryside, and I can only encourage people to go to the village. I heard the other day a very nice phrase, which I want to share with you here. I don't know how to exactly put it in Russian, but maybe Nina, you know. The person told me, we have the saying in Russian that God built the village and people built the cities. And there is this divine spirit of the villages. So we are lucky here. We have a Magazin Produkti, which means we have a little shop where two elderly ladies are there from 7 to 7 every day. And you will find everything from cheese, butter, shoelaces, umbrellas, everything is there. Fresh food, tinned food, everything. And this is marvelous. You can pay there with your credit card. You can pay in all kinds of things. Try to find that in Austria or Germany. No way. So this is the way I live in the countryside. And there are two pieces of advice I often give to the younger colleagues, the students in the early 20s. I tell them, first of all, don't get stuck in Moscow and St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg was built in the historic context of the war against the Swedish. It was looking to the West. It was all of absorbing, bringing Europe to Russia. But we are now in 21st century, the Asian century, and what was once the periphery of Russia, namely the Far East, Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, the Amur Krai region, and so on. This is not anymore periphery. This is center stage. And for instance, at the University of Khabarovsk, where I have been lecturing now twice, amazing colleagues, amazing standards of legal studies, chemical studies. Go east, this is where the music is playing. And in terms of, I lost now my thread, what I wanted to say, but it's this going east that I always tell students. Yeah. And the other thing is that I tell them, not for certain professions, and ever since the pandemic, we are aware that there is this hybrid version of working, as I do now. I do certain things online, but I don't teach online. For my courses, I always go physically somewhere. But you can live in the village. And there are many, many reasons why I have always moved to the village. One is because I'm a village person and I need nature. But the other element, for instance, in Austria, for me, definitely was a financial one. And the apartment rent in St. Petersburg was tremendous. While here I can live, I can build a little house. I have very good services also from Gazprom. I'm now a Gazprom client. And maintenance costs are much, much, much lower here than in the city.
Thank you for elaborating. I think your experience is probably more universal in terms of that tension between the city and the so-called periphery, because when I moved from Toronto, Canada to middle of nowhere Rocky Mountains, I still hear from my friends back there that I'm crazy to live in the boondocks. And if I have my way, I don't think I'll ever live anywhere other than outside the city, even though I was born and raised in Moscow and I've always, loved the urban lifestyle until I realized that there's something better without, as you said, traffic congestion, with, not having to go to the park to get out of the concrete of the city, just kind of being out in nature as soon as you step out. I think it's just, even for your mental health in terms of all the stresses that you deal anyway, is just so much better than having, to take your 2-week vacation once a year. But you mentioned something interesting. You talked about Veliki Novgorod, because there are two, right? There are two Novgorods in Russia. And this is the one, I think today it's almost like a politically incorrect statement to make in terms of the political climate, because this is the city from which the early ancient Russian state moved to Kiev, right? And whenever you see some of this political propaganda, you hear that Moscow was much younger than Kiev, and everyone forgets about this other city, which is a Russian city from where this ancient Russian / Ukrainian state originated. So I think this would be a good time for us to jump into the topic of today, which is basically history strikes back. I think we want to examine the connections between history and the present, and the way some current events are deeply rooted in history, regardless of what certain politicians try to do about them. But before we address the general topics, I want to make sure that we cover the subject that's probably the most requested subject from our previous conversation. You made a very intriguing comment about Austrians being German-speaking Slavs, and I really would like you to elaborate on that before I ask you my questions.
Yeah. Well, it's a little hypothesis, you know. It's Karin Kneissl's copyright, if you want. I have not yet found any book about it. Maybe there is one in Russian or somewhere which I'm not aware of. I haven't seen any book in German or English. But I think I mentioned in our first conversation that I was intrigued by the Arabic term for Austria, because in Arabic, which I speak much better than Russian and which I studied at university, in Arabic, all nations' names usually have the Latin root into the Arabic version. Like Italy is Al Italia, Germany is Al Almania. So there's a Latin root to it. France is Al Faranza, but Austria is Animsa. It's not Al Austria, Austriche. In Farsi, it's Autriche. No, it's Animsa, and I never understood why it's this word Animsa, and Nims is the groundhound, by the way, but it has nothing to do with it. And then one person who I met and who happened to speak both Russian and Arabic, he told me that in Slavic languages, the German, which actually is the one who doesn't speak, who is unable to speak, is the Nemtsky, Nemtsov, Nemet, and it's a very frequent name because we always had these people from Germany who somehow came to Slavic countries. And so when the Ottomans with Arabic soldiers arrived in Central Europe, this is where the hypothesis of Karin Kneissl starts. There were the true Germans, the Almaniun, and Alemannic actually is also what you will find in Salzburg, Tyrol, going to Switzerland. People are different. They are Alemannic. They're more German, if you want, Bavarians. And then there were those Nimsawiyin, these people from Animsa in the southern and eastern part, who spoke German, but they were not Germans. And my hypothesis is that those people from eastern and southern part of Austria, going into former Yugoslavia, Slovenia, Vienna, North, Vienna, East, the region where I lived, these people, in terms of mentality, everybody will tell you, are very much different from the people in Salzburg or Tyrol. There's really a kind of cultural east-west divide. I myself, I'm partially from Tyrol, and we are much more hands-on people. You know, we are not so phlegmatic. We are not seeing ourselves as victims of history or whatever. We just get things done, and this is this more Alemannic lifestyle, and much more direct, you know, in terms of call a spade, while in Eastern Austria, Vienna, I always felt a much more, how should I say, melancholic and phlegmatic, a different mentality. Not as warm-hearted, definitely not as warm-hearted what I find today in Russia, not as generous, different. But Austria is, I don't want to go into too much detail about Austria because I might become too nasty. This Slavic mentality definitely is there. It's also due to the fact that there always was a mix of people coming from Bohemia, Moravia, today's Czech Republic. And when there were still telephone books and you would open the telephone books, you would find a very high number of Slavic names, because these people simply came and moved to Vienna, which was the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and large parts of it were dominated by Slavic people who wanted to have also their own nation state, and that's how the whole thing disintegrated for good reasons. But when I say Austrians are Slavic-speaking Germans, it maybe also explains, at least this was the case for me, the huge difference between Berlin and Vienna. I, I, I never felt at ease at home in Berlin, even though people speak German and I speak German. But I always felt somehow at ease in Slovenia, which I know very well, in Croatia, in Serbia, Prague to a certain extent. I don't speak any of these languages, but I felt at ease because I rediscovered same lifestyle, coffee houses. I'm speaking now also of foregone times, anti-Starbucks, and it was for me like one cultural pond, in which people lived. So this is what I mean by Austrians being German-speaking Slavs.
So it sounds like you're almost putting culture and maybe a little bit of ideology above any kind of actual ethnic connections to one culture or another, and like the people's blood, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah, that's an interesting remark. I mean, you can of course discuss that can go to war because of that, and because of that very reason, Austrians went to war twice, and they started World War One and they started World War Two exactly because of that topic. Before World War One, you had this rise of nationalism on all sides. The Italians wanted to get rid of the Austrian rule. The Czechs wanted to get rid of Habsburg rule, etc. But the Vienna didn't really realize it. It was much too passive, and the outbreak of World War One was definitely the fact that this big cultural something could not persist because there were these ideologies, because there was it was a matter of time that it would implode. And that was all what World War One was about. It started in the Balkans. It started in this confrontation between St. Petersburg and Vienna. I mentioned that many people here in Russia are under the illusion that Austrians are so Russian loving, etc., and they all love Vienna. And I always try to explain them that this is pure Austrian opportunism, quick, easy Russian money. Let's take it. But when you look into the larger historical roots, you will always see betrayal by the Austrians towards the Russians at many, many instances, at least through the last 300 years of history. And St. Petersburg and Vienna were genuine rivals. It was power politics rivalry. And it was also, as a footnote, doesn't count anymore so much today in an Austrian context, but Catholics versus Orthodox. Because the Habsburgs considered themselves as the power center of political Catholic establishment. And so World War One, it started in Vienna, definitely. World War Two, it was started by an Austrian, Mr. Hitler, who was brought up in this Central European mishmash and in this cultural pond, if I may reuse this term. And he was the one who, not he by himself, he was supported, as we know, by millions, especially Austrians who applauded him. But it was all about one of the main topics for his campaign was the German superiority over Slavic inferiority, and that Austrians are Germans. And this was one of the momenta, I would say even the main momenta, that resulted in World War II. So the two big total wars, the huge wars, the mass killings, were triggered either by Austrians or throughout Austria.
That's really interesting because usually when students study World War I, they are presented with several theories. And one theory is that it was Germany. There's a theory that it was actually Russia that started World War I. So it's very interesting for me to hear you put, if anyone had to be blamed, you putting blame on Austria and justifying it in this particular way. If you could maybe talk a little bit more about the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and you did talk about the sort of the nationalisms that were arising within it and the impact that it's had on long-term history, maybe going even into the present in terms of the relations. Go ahead.
May I just jump in here for a second? This what you just described, Dr. Kneissl, sounds a lot like what's happening in Ukraine right now. Just,
Well,
you know,
I mean,
the sentiment.
Western Ukraine was part of
part
of that region, right? So
But
it's
Nina just jumped in a question that has been really bugging me. That is these new spheres of influence that are going on now, and we are seeing Erdogan, for example, speaking about, I'm not saying he's trying, perhaps he's trying, but he's speaking about the recreation of the Ottoman Empire in a certain way. And Nina just talked about the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and this is one movement that I've been watching, is a real, you know, closing together of Austria and Hungary. And since this new multipolarity type of thing is rising, and we are seeing these blocks, this kind of blocks re-emerging or trying to re-emerge, perhaps in a different matter, this is a concern, well, not a concern, but something that I think about is perhaps if the type of Austro-Hungarian bloc, I will not say empire, but bloc rising again somehow in the models that it was back in the time. No.
Yeah, no, I don't see any chance for that. If chance is the wrong word, I don't see any option for that, because this Austro-Hungarian Empire, for the last 150 years of its existence, was totally relying on the imperial figure as such. You know, it could have broken apart much earlier if there hadn't been this long rule of Kaiser Franz Joseph, who was in power from 1848 to 1916. And before him, you had two other long-ruling Habsburg emperors, who as persons incarnated the empire. And especially Emperor Franz Joseph was this figure. Plus, you had transnational dynasties who played a role. And I would say there were two transnational elements in this, against the backdrop of this rise of nationalism, which was pushed by, they called themselves then liberals, and their liberalism was actually coming from the lower bourgeoisie. It was not the haute bourgeoisie, it was not the wealthy upper middle class, so to say. It was the middle class, the lower middle class, that pushed it, because they would find for themselves in nationalism a home, while old aristocratic families, they could do without a state. They had their family, you know, they had their estate, they had their latifundien, you know, the farms. And they didn't need the state so much. They would be at ease whether they lived now on some big finca in Spain, or whether they would move to one of their castles in the Rhine Valley or in Bohemia or in northern Italy. They were transnational. And this kind of transnational spirit doesn't exist. The EU bureaucrats, they don't have it. You know, they're interested in their per diems, in their salary, in their next career step. they certainly lack this kind of transnational thinking. They don't have it. They talk about it, but they don't have it. And the other group, what I would consider as essential for how this empire functioned, and other of these multinational empires, like the Russian Empire, was of course the role also of the Jewish intelligentsia that was part of it, because they also were by definition transnational. What counted for them were the contacts via also the larger family. It was within, in that case, the religious or the ethnic group, depending on how you define Jewish, Jewry, religious or ethnic. And so I don't see any chance, not the slightest chance, for any re-emergence of an Austro-Hungarian thinking. Even so, with the breakdown of Yugoslavia, with the breakdown of the Soviet Union, there are hundreds of articles in the early 1990s in that sense. But for that, you would need the people, you would need the dynasty that keeps it together. It's missing, and even so, against the backdrop of contemporary current day-to-day politics, Mr. Orban in Hungary, maybe a right-wing government in Vienna. It doesn't look like. I don't think that they will manage to build a government. We'll see big vacuum in Austria with very dangerous implications. It's a topic of essays that come up again and again, but there's no underpinning. There's no political or cultural underpinning for the whole thing. That, to come back to the question of Nina in the beginning of what World War One and all those traces that it left, I never learned a lot about World War One because our history courses at school were very poor, reduced, and we were all shaped by 1945 as a watershed line, 1955 as a watershed line. However, later on, when I wrote my doctoral dissertation on concept of borders, frontiers in Middle East, I was studying a lot the partition plans, decision making in London and Paris. And I had to understand that World War One was the watershed line. First, it was for me the watershed line for anything that would happen later on in the Middle East, the building of the mandates and so on. But in my 30s, 40s, when I started to read, I'm not a historian, I'm just fond of reading about history. And I understood more and more this watershed line that was 1918. And there's this famous sociologist, philosopher Eric Hobsbawm, who made the very good definition, speaking of the long 19th century, which he puts from 1815, end of Napoleonic Wars, to 1914, outbreak of World War One, and the short 20th century, the short bloody 20th century, as Hobsbawm said, which starts for him, I think, with 1914 or 1918 and ends in 1989. So 21st century for Hobsbawm started already in the 1990s. And I think he's right, because we had this technological advance of internet. We had the new world order and so on. So we have been now into 21st century for at least 30 years something. And I share that approach. And in Austria, we never celebrated that had anything to do with World War One. Even so, Austria was totally reshuffled by World War One. While when I lived in France, 11th of November, the end of World War One, it was celebrated in every village. And when I was there in the 1980s, there were still veterans. They found sometimes who could tell about how it all started. And so from a British and French perspective, World War One plays a role. It's reflected in commemoration, while it was never ever reflected in any German or Austrian's daily life.
That's very interesting because in Canada, November 11th is marked in the same way as, the British would mark it and the French would. But in Russia, I think only recently is there this new understanding of World War I, obviously because Russia had its revolution in the middle of that war and basically everything kind of got derailed. So I don't think there was much focus in terms of public perception of that war, and obviously World War II just dominated everything since 1945. So I think only recently in public memory has there been this maybe regaining of understanding of the importance of that war as, the collapse of the three empires, the Ottoman, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Russian, and all the implications, like you're saying, in the Middle East and Europe, et cetera, et cetera. So I have two questions for you based on what you just said, and please let me know whether I should remind you. One question is more general. You talked a little bit about the concept of the nation state. In some ways, it's a response to these imperial formations. To what extent do you think the nation state is artificial, and whether it really has a future in Europe? And my other question is more specific. You said that Austrians have been a little bit opportunistic in their connection to Russia, but if you look at the early 19th century, there are all these alliances, like the alliance between Russia and Austria, in terms of being this conservative, these conservative leaders in Europe. Was it really opportunistic on the part of Austria at that time, or was it a genuine concern for liberalization that was happening in the rest, or some parts of Europe, I would say?
Mm-hmm. The nation state, is it artificial? Well, when you take old nation states like France, which is totally different from Germany, and people don't realize it from the outside. I come across it every day talking to Russians when they speak about Europe, and I always say there is no such thing as Europe. That's of course there's the European Union as a bureaucratic monster, but as otherwise, Portugal, Germany, Austria, Italy, they're worlds apart, despite all globalization and whatever kind of common features you might find. Because when you take it from the way statehood was built, if I may take the examples of Germany and France, yes, France is a relatively old, genuine nation state. It functions as a nation state. They had their building of the nation state done in such a strict way that anything that would be in terms of regional languages was totally repressed. There were different efforts, movements in terms of the Occitan language in the Provence, or some other languages in southwestern France, Breton in northwestern France. It was all totally suppressed. And a new sort of regionalism and promoting those regional languages, promoting regional traditional costumes, etc. It started here and there, but it remained folkloric and it remained anecdotal. While when you take Germany, which grew together, always was created as a nation state in the 1870s by Bismarck, who did the whole thing for the German emperor, who made him a German emperor. There was no German emperor before that. It was the Holy Roman Empire, which was a patchwork thing going from Netherlands, Spain, across the Habsburgs to Moldova, etc. But it was a big carpet with lots of holes. And federalism in Germany is ancient, and it has always been there, and it has grown because there was an independent Bavaria, there was an independent Saxony, there was a House of Hanover, which then gave a new dynasty to the British. So it's a different story, the way Germany was made. And knowing France and Germany a little bit from inside, I had come to the conclusion over the last few years that Germany is provincial. Germany will never be able to project interests in a larger geopolitical way. Germany used to be an economic powerhouse. These times are gone. And otherwise, Germany is totally provincial. And the Germans are unable to formulate something like national interests. They are unable. And this has, of course, to do with National Socialism. It has to do with 1945, but it goes much deeper in my opinion. It goes really into this kind of federalist development where common German interests were never formulated. And there is no diplomatic tradition in Germany. When Bismarck established the first German Ministry for Foreign Affairs in the 1870s, he had a hard time to find people who would be recruited to become diplomats, because any young German nobleman wanted to become a general, but not an ambassador. And there is no German tradition of diplomacy. There's none. And it's not only Mrs. Baerbock, which is now a kind of very illustrative example of the non-existence of diplomacy in Germany. Baerbock is a German example. And in contrast to that, you have an Italian corps diplomatique, because there is a legacy to it. You have a Spanish corps diplomatique, you have a French corps diplomatique, even though Macron tried to destroy it, which is always there, which functions regardless of who is in power as a minister. This is not the case in Germany. This is not the case in Austria. Even though Austria has maybe a little bit of a longer history, but Austria is not important as a diplomatic player, and it did its utmost to destroy its potential roles over the last years. So you have a tradition of diplomacy in the Russian Tsarist Empire that survived Soviet Union, that was revitalized to a certain extent in the early 2000s. But you don't have this kind of tradition in Germany. And now to come back to this question of nation state, yes, there is an old, genuine nation state in France. There is not one in Spain to the same extent, because of other historic contexts, also the way that nation state was fabricated. And when it comes to the German nation state, this is a huge, huge, huge big issue, into which I don't want to venture because it will become too controversial. But comparing federalist Germany to the central unity state, France, despite all the efforts of regionalization, you can say the French nation state has grown, while the German nation state didn't grow to the same extent. And now when we go more east, Marcelo pointed out the quagmire of Ukraine. In Ukraine, like in the breakdown of Yugoslavia, which was, of course, also pushed from the outside, but there were a lot of how do you call that, centrifugal forces in Yugoslavia. They just wanted to get out of Belgrade control. And in both cases, we have a brother war. People who used to be married to each other are now in warfare. This is a huge similarity between Yugoslavia and Ukraine. And you have proxy war. I would never call neither Yugoslavia nor Ukraine as a civil war. It's proxy wars. And you have the fault lines that Huntington described in his article about the clash of civilizations. He spoke about these cultural, ethnic, religious fault lines. And he wrote his article about clash of civilization against the backdrop of what was going on in Yugoslavia. So he mentioned the Catholic and the Orthodox fault line, which you have between Croatia and Serbia. And the bloodiest fighting was in Krajina, which used to be Serb-dominated part of later nation-state Croatia. And Krajina in many Slavic languages means like frontier region. It's the Grai, it's the frontier, it's the edge, the end. And it's of course also as a semantically in the nation state Ukraine. Now there are many people who contest the artificial character of nation state Ukraine. What is a fact, and here we come back to Austria, is that it was the Austrians who were among the biggest financiers, sponsors in late 19th century of Ukrainian nationalism, because it meant weakening the Tsar's empire. So in Galicia, which was run by the Austrians, money was pushed into Russia to weaken Russia from inside. This was sabotage made in Vienna. And by the way, also just as a footnote, I came across it only a year or two ago. The Azov regiment by Bandera was founded in Vienna in 1929. So you have this context, and there was a lot of talk recently about a strange map that Mr. Karl Habsburg, who is a member of the European Parliament and the grandson of the last emperor, in which he claimed also Russia has to be divided into 40 different states. And it had a lot of media reflection here in Russia. And people asked me, oh, how come we always that the Austrians were so Russia friendly? I said, you have an illusion. You are misinformed, totally misinformed. It's this romantic Russian view. They always thought, Vienna is so pretty, and they always underestimated that Vienna is different. There's this history. So the nation state, the more you go into Central and Eastern Europe, of course, is in its outcome of World War I, mostly. Ukraine, also World War II played into it. Of course, you can contest it. And we come back to the outcome of World War I with the creation of all those artificial borders and minorities. Because all of a sudden you had hundreds of thousands of Hungarians living in a nation state called Romania. You had hundreds of thousands of Polish in Germany, Germans in Poland and Czech Republic, etc., etc. So that was a problem in the 1920s, 30s. Hitler, the Austrian, also played on that when it came to the Germans in Poland and Czechoslovakia. But I do hope from the bottom of my heart that we are not going to replay this whole bloody history that we have seen from the 30s and 40s. But nothing is to be excluded.
So would you say that some of these states that arose as a result of the Versailles Treaty and everything that was linked to it afterwards received kind of an artificial boost? That they should have been part of maybe a larger entity, not necessarily an empire, but something a little bit larger that would account for these ethnocultural differences, instead of doing what they did with Germany, like you're saying, they would give this German-speaking part to France, for instance, and that had no really connection to that part, with the exception of maybe a few decades.
Well, I think there was a dynamic in 1919 in all these strange conferences taking part around Paris, Trianon, Sèvres, etc. There was a dynamic which could not have been stopped in those days. I was not there, but all the books that I have read about it, and one of my favorite books is by Margaret Macmillan. You might know the lady. She's a Canadian historian, and she's actually, I think, the great-granddaughter of Lord Macmillan, who was one of the British prime ministers back then. So what happened in 1919, 1920s, I don't think that anybody could have stopped it. And I wouldn't blame those people now in retrospect and say, you made these and those mistakes. Of course they made mistakes, but there was a dynamic. And plus, people were very hungry and nobody knew how to feed them and how to run the whole show. So easy to give any advice or to make a diagnostic, or this and that mistake was committed. But I think that to be a little bit critical of this wonderful European Union, which I'm not so much a fan of, they always claimed from day one that they are actually this larger framework in which all these people would find themselves again, Europe without borders, in a Europe of total free movement, etc., etc. And when we had the big enlargement of 2004, when 10 new members, mostly from North, Eastern and Central Eastern Europe, joined, for a moment, people thought, oh, now we are, so to say, back to this larger something. But it doesn't work for good reasons. Because it was only about free movement of capital, but people became at the same time totally ahistorical. I prefer to use the word ahistorical and not whatever word else one could use. By ahistorical, I mean it's not that they know little about history, it's that they are not at all interested. It's like apolitical. They're not interested. They don't give a damn about history. And when you are not interested in the culture and the historical context and so on, you make mistakes. You make mistakes. And that's what Brussels is doing versus Hungary, versus Poland, by calling them all kinds of things, being not European enough, etc. And ignoring the high price that the Polish people have sacrificed for Europe, that the Hungarians have sacrificed for Europe, how deeply European, Polish culture, etc. is. They simply don't realize it because they don't care. And or to call countries like Italy and Greece periphery country because they are not good enough in their GDP standards. I mean, this all is a reflection of this ahistorical approach that you have by Brussels and by these institutions. So yes, we have now this 27 contributing to something. They have their in disagreement about many topics, but it's all about it has become a very sterile capitalist structure that is in deep financial trouble, but where the soul is gone. Maybe it never was there.
Would you say that this ahistoric trajectory that you describe is also connected to the very concept of the West at its foundation? Because today, when we say the West, we implicitly include, countries like Greece, for instance. But if you were to go back, a few thousand years to what today is described as the foundation of Western civilization, it was more about the Mediterranean basin and the countries around it, some of which countries have nothing to do with, modern Europe. And so that rebranding to fit a particular ideology combined with this lack of interest in history is a little bit of a disaster. I mean, from my perspective, but I'm curious how you view this.
Yeah, it's a big quagmire. And I'm part of those who often see Europe from the outside because I was a lot socialized in the Arab world, and Lebanese, Syrians, Egyptians, they would have this very nostalgic, admirative, respectful approach to Europe. Dreamland. And this is how I also discovered my Europe, if I may say, as a dreamland, from their perspective. You have to go to Europe. It's there you have constitution, there you have human rights, there you have the opportunities to improve your life. I still knew this generation of people from Egypt and Lebanon who were able to do it. Yes, they could do it. And Europe was all about rule of law and freedoms. And people who would go there, they would enrich Europe and bring back the best and pass it on to the next generation back home. That would be Cairo or Damascus or whatever. Now, this is not what Europe is about because Europe today is not anymore the Europe of pluralism. It's not anymore the Europe of the best universities in the world. Forget about it. It's not anymore about a Europe where engineering, geniuses are around. Just as another interesting figure, which I often quote, 9 out of 10 German stock market listed companies were created before World War One. So all the big inventions, the Siemens, the Bosch, the Diesel, the Carl Benz, you name it, you have it, they all lived in late 19th century. So, and the patents and the achievements and the innovation, it was late 19th century. This Europe right now is, first of all, it has lost its rule of law, it has lost freedoms, civil liberties on all levels. I think in 1848, when they made a big revolution to get rid of the Habsburg rule, there were bigger concessions than what governments would give them today. This is the main drama, because I always say Europe could overcome a recession, it could overcome an energy crisis, but it will not overcome the fact that it has lost rule of law. This is the fundamental drama for today's Europe.
Is there some kind of fundamental underlying reason, let's say some kind of a spiritual reason? You know, some people would say, well, it's the loss of Christianity that made Europe what it is. Other people use some other criteria to identify sort of the biggest issue that Europe is facing. What do you think is that root of the problem that no longer maybe unites the people in the way these aristocratic families did in the past? The loss of spirit. How would you define it?
Well, Europe was always at its best, in my opinion, when it was in small entities which were competing with each other, because each one of these dukes and archdukes tried to attract the best theaters, the best universities. And when you had a problem with your duke, with your lord in one entity, you could easily move on 60, 80, 200 kilometers. You didn't have to walk far to be under the rule of another sovereign. And that's what Martin Luther, the founder of Protestantism, did. That's what Schiller, Richard Wagner, all these people who were not only artistic genius, but also politically very active. And they moved within Germany then to a different place. Some of them emigrated to France, which was also not too far away. So it was easier to persist in that Europe of hundreds of different entities and to compete. You could attract the best. And ever since Europe has become this monolithic, boring bureaucracy, you don't attract anymore anybody. It's a fact, you know.
This is really interesting, because I don't know if you'll take it as a compliment, but this is what the late Henry Kissinger said about Europe as well, that at its best, Europe was kind of this disconnected, disparate entity where you had hundreds of these little political statelets that would compete with each other, but that would sort of bring out the best of them, maybe excluding some of these old nation states like France that you described. So I think it's really interesting that he really caught on to that as well. I don't think he was as critical of the European Union as you are, but it's kind of fascinating that, you both have this diplomatic background and you caught on to that particular something that now seems to be missing. But I'd like to go a little bit back to World War I, since you have all this. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. There's one more thought that comes to my mind in order to answer your question, why Europe has lost its soul. What I realized over the last few years, when I was 2020, when I was still back in Europe, is actually this black and white thinking that does not exist in Russia, that does not exist in Arab world, whatever is Orient. It re-emerged all across Europe. And it was about illegal immigration, you're in favor, you're against. It was about COVID and vaccination. Later on, it was about you're with Russia or against Ukraine or vice versa. So these were the watershed lines. It was like, are you a right believer or a wrong believer, heresy or not? And I would even call a totalitarian thinking. I never ever had thought that this kind of totalitarian thinking is so widely spread in Europe. And it's not in the Orient. Maybe I'm too romantic myself about the Oriental picture, but I lived in Lebanon in 22, 23 under very tough circumstances. It was not yet war, like recently, not now, but it was a horrible economic situation. People totally exhausted, worn out, but it was still a live and let live attitude. And in Lebanon, I had more freedom of speech than I had in Austria or Germany. In Lebanon, I would be able to see all sorts of TV. I could open all sorts of internet pages, which I could not do in Germany or Austria. So totalitarianism is a truly European thing and not an Eastern thing.
May I jump in just a second? This is extremely interesting because, when you say about this black and white way of view, in Brazil, when I was young, we were just spitting out, order words like down to imperialism and everything, but there was some critical thinking. It was mostly a teenager thing, but there was some critical thinking. And we are talking about, I'm from 81, so let's say he had just ended the Cold War, more or less, where the timeline where I'm talking about. And the Cold War period, which in Brazil was a dictatorship, a military dictatorship, like all Latin America, mostly, we had these, we are here to stop communism. So there was this very black and white communism against capitalism and all that. But then that's over, and the word kind of evolved. And years later in Brazil, I saw this coming back. People talking about stopping communism. Dude, it's 2025. What are you talking about? What are we talking about? And I'm listening to this kind of things here. When the war, the special military operation started, I saw people freaking out here in Italy, and very, very smart people. I always work with very smart people, freaking out like, oh dear Lord, the Russians are coming. And I couldn't believe my eyes on that. And how do you think we got to this point? This is interesting. I've been to Egypt recently, and I saw that people there were very much more critical on what's going on. Yeah, there is we know that's the United States that's doing this or that. But in the same point, yeah, but it's also the fault of our government because they allow it to happen here. This is a different kind of a more elastic thinking. Yeah, they are doing that, but we are allowing it. It's more elastic thinking. Here's Russians are coming.
Well, because Russia is East and East is bad, East is autocratic, East is big, the Greek city-states 2,400 years ago, democratic market economy, wonderful small values. And on the other side, the Persian Empire, authoritarian dictatorship. You replace Xerxes by Putin or the Mongolians by the Red Army or whatever. It's this Eastern thing. And Russia is East. So there's the poor little West, blackmailed, occupied, frightened, eaten up by bad East. It's this East-West antagonism.
Well, it sounds like Poland and Hungary get a little bit of that Eastern, end of the stick, even though they're not exactly, especially Poland, not exactly pro-Russian these days, but they're still classified as being Eastern European, which I believe is a strictly Cold War period terminology, which I know they themselves don't really like. And I think that goes to that idea that you previously discussed of old Europe versus new Europe, and how do supposedly the two Europes coincide with each other.
Yeah. Well, I am getting you to put our conversation on another note and going out from history to geography. In Russia, I have to get used now to the fact that 200 kilometers is not far. And this Canadians would most probably, Australians see it in a similar way. But when you come from Central Europe like myself, 200 kilometers, you're already outside of the country. You have countries that are not even longer than 120 kilometers. So this is something on a certain level I always enjoyed about Austria, that within 30 minutes I would change landscape and food and atmospheres, and I would be in 2 hours in Budapest, in 4 hours in Prague. Now here I fly for 7 time zones and I'm still in Russia. So geography, of course, is shaping your mindset, and you think big, you think in a different way. But I am impressed in Russia that they speak one Russian language, because in the small German-speaking space, people don't understand each other, because between the German, the way people speak it in Switzerland, or in Eastern Austria, or Southern Austria, or Northern Germany, or Central Germany, there are so many different regional accents there. People don't easily communicate because they wouldn't really not understand vocabulary and pronunciation. And here in Russia, it's this one language as a bond, and there is a centralization via culture, which is interesting for me, because also Arabic, there's so many dialects, there's so much miscommunication. And I think we are, what we will most probably see is at least 2 parallel movements which are totally contradictory, namely this centrifugalism, this destruction, if you want, of the nation state, either by ethno-tribal movements like we had in Yugoslavia. It was ethno-tribal. It was ethno-national. It was not just national; it was ethnic national. And this is also to a certain extent happening in Ukraine. And at the same time, you have this globalist thing, and you have technology, and you have innovation that puts people closer, like we are enjoying our video conference. But I think these trends will be in parallel and in total contradiction. And the good thing is, I always tried to take the best out of all these worlds. So you can live in the smallness and be nonetheless in this bigger context. And this is what technology provides us with in our setting. But I always try to still be the master of the game. I don't want to be eaten up by my cell phone or by surfing the internet, which is great. I like doing it as well. But in between, luckily, there's always a dog or a cat who tells me, let's go for a walk.
This is one reason to keep pets. They keep us well exercised,
Yeah.
whether or not it's minus 20 Celsius outside. But I'd like to jump back to World War II, because you are a specialist in the Middle East, and talk about the differences between the rising of all these, semi-artificial small states in Europe versus the mandates, right? The League of Nations mandates that were applied to the Middle East, and sort of the implications that those decisions had for current political circumstances. We're now 100 years from that period.
Excuse me, I did not really get the question. On World War II,
So World War I, League of Nations mandates that were applied to the Middle East, to Lebanon, to your area of specialization, to Palestine, the French and the British mandates. what implications did those decisions that were made, now 100 years ago have for politics today? Because you could say some of those decisions were essentially these ticking time bombs that perhaps there were not really, hindsight is 2020, but some of those things could have perhaps been foreseen. Because you're a specialist in the region, I'm wondering what your perception is.
Well, I always say when it comes to the Arab world, West Asia, Middle East, World War I is not yet over. What was decided in 1915, Balfour Declaration, a Jewish national home, the different ideas of reshuffling the maps, all that was done within or in the aftermath of World War I. And it was in World War I that those who were victorious and those who were defeated understood the importance of oil. So because World War I was the first war in the name of mobility. You had airplanes, you had tanks, you did not anymore have the horses as the one and most important sign of mobility. So World War I is not yet over in the region. And this, I think, is not at all understood by people who think that you can solve the whole question by some deal in terms of real estate, because yesterday Donald Trump actually, he did not say something new. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, had already said in Harvard a year ago that Gaza would be a wonderful beach waterfront investment. So they see the world in terms of real estate, and they see the piece of land that you can make money with. They don't see this piece of land as part of a territory. It's just real estate. And this is maybe the interesting fact, development, and it's also not new, because if I may go back to late 18th, beginning 19th century, when these East India trade companies were established by the British and the Dutch, they would also buy a piece of land called Hong Kong and turn it into a colony. So you buy land and you turn it into a colony state or whatever. That happened all along 19th century. Everybody did it among the colonial powers. The British and the Dutch did it maybe best, and the Portuguese. But this attitude of let's take a piece of land, let's take people out, let's put new people. You would think it's not anymore possible, but no, the thinking is there. And I was astonished that all these news agencies last night were going crazy and saying, "Oh, what a crazy idea by Donald Trump." It's not totally new. His son-in-law has said it twice, 3 times. I discussed it in my podcast, and Trump said it again, and Benjamin Netanyahu was standing next to him in this press conference, looked very pleased. I don't think that he looked surprised. It's a topic people are discussing. So you have this old, ancient conflict. You have all the religious, you have all the security elements in there, you have the nuclear dimension in it. And then people say, let's treat it from the point of view of real estate. So it's on the one hand, it's totally crazy. On the other hand, I'm not at all surprised, because this attitude has existed also previously.
I mean, some analysts are saying that this is the type of thinking that might lead to a real World War III, whereas others are saying we have been in World War III for a while now, in which Ukraine is, one piece of the puzzle. How do you view this? I mean, it's a very explosive situation as it is, and if that decision is made in terms of trying to either make it into American territory or an American-controlled territory for the state of Israel, where do you see that going? I know it's very difficult to make these predictions, but I don't know if you can if you can elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, well, when Ariel Sharon, the late prime minister, who was a radical in his time, when he decided that Israel should withdraw from Gaza in 2005, he was harshly attacked. And he said it doesn't make sense to keep this 9,000 Jewish settlers in Gaza, protected by thousands of soldiers and surrounded by millions of Arabs who hate us. So he decided to move out, and Israel never really moved out. Israel moved in again and again and devastated Gaza at many instances. Now it was the most comprehensive and total devastation. World remained silent, not a single sanction, as we know, against Israel. So this is the situation. But I don't see this now that the US Marines would do there some landing and take it over. This is out of question. Of course, you have people today sitting in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, in Doha, in all these, I call them the supermarkets of the desert, in these business centers. And they have done the Abraham's Accords with Israel. They have started diplomatic normalization with Israel upon mediation of the Trumps. Jared Kushner did it, is the son-in-law. And I never gave lots of credit to these Abraham's Accords under the title of peace agreement. There is no Palestinian statehood. They don't foresee it. They don't want it. It's all about doing business. And Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Doha can do perfect business with Israel. They've done it over the last decades already. When these Abraham's Accords were done, and it was also Netanyahu's vision always for coexistence with the Palestinians, give them some money, let them do business, let some of the leaders become rich, let some of them drive a Mercedes, they will be happy. And they don't speak anymore about Palestinian statehood. Now, I don't think that this works. Yes, there are always traitors. There are always people who will take the money and denounce their grandmother. This has always been maybe in a higher proportion in that part of the world than in others. But it doesn't work.
Do you view what's going on in the Middle East in the same framework with the war in Ukraine? Or do you think they're sort of separate pieces of, or maybe different puzzles?
There is a certain connection via the fact that we have a new class of mercenaries. And people who would wander from one battlefield to the next and work for those who pay best. And we see this definitely today in Syria, that mercenaries who were for a while in Ukraine or who were for a while with the British here and there would then move to Syria and vice versa. So in terms of mercenary, drugs money, arms dealing, it's supply and demand in an interconnected world. On the other hand, Ukraine and the battlefields of Syria, Gaza, West Bank, etc., I don't think that you can really bring them into one large coherent picture. But the fact that they happen in tandem, in parallel, and the way Russia is scorned for what's going on in Ukraine, but Russia never was killing civilians in the same way that the UN also called the graveyard of children, that Gaza is the graveyard of the Palestinian children. I think 16,000, 17,000 children were killed. Tens of thousands were maimed. So this is with all the horrors that we have all across Ukraine and in many frontier regions in Russia, like Kursk, we don't have the same way of targeting civilians as we have seen Israel targeting its civilians. And this, I would say, given that it both happened at the same time, and the way the rest of the world reacted to both conflicts is very, very different. We have seen total silence in Europe, and some activities, some efforts by certain countries like South Africa, but nobody really moved a big finger for the Palestinians. And everybody stands with Ukraine for the while. Could be different in a few months from now. But nobody stood with the Palestinians truly right up to the end. Yes, we had the campus protests in the US, but that was it.
Do you see the difference in reactions solely as a result of media propaganda, or is there something deeper there?
There's something deeper. There is the remaining bad conscience by the West that they also remained silent when Jews, and not only Jews, communists, people who had a dissenting opinion, were killed in an industrial way by Germans, Austrians, Polish, Baltics. So this is, of course, still the this bad conscience, yes, and this feel of guilt of the third and fourth generation afterwards. And in the German-speaking press, whether it's Germany or Austria, when I compare it with the 80s, and I started then collecting clippings of reports about Israel, Palestinian problem, and so on. In the 80s, you would have a much more skeptical, and I would say even Israel critical reporting than you have today. And anti-Semitism today doesn't come from the right, it doesn't come, so to say, from the conservatives or the extreme right wings, whatever you call them. It really comes from the left. And all these new right-wing parties, they are more realistic than the king. They applaud Israel, and they wouldn't have anything against the annexation of West Bank and Gaza. They simply would take it. There's not a single word of criticism. So in the 1980s, 90s, you had a much higher investigative and differentiated description of Israel and analysis of Israel than you have today.
It sounds like it's connected to the black and white thinking that you mentioned earlier, where that critical thinking just doesn't really exist to the level that it did. Well, now that we're talking about these very pessimistic issues, I'll ask you a question which could have a pessimistic or an optimistic answer. We started with history, but let's move into the future. Is there a hope for Europe? And obviously, Europe is a very loaded term, so you can define it however you see fit.
There's no hope for Europe because Europe was all about rule of law and freedom. This is what Europe for me was all about. You know, I'm not so much into the Europe of Christianity and so on. For me, it was really freedom, rule of law, and this is gone. And this, I think, will be gone for at least 30 years. So there's no future for Europe. Plus, add to that that they will have huge economic troubles, and they already have them, that the US couldn't care less about Europe. They never speak of Europe, they speak of the Europeans. So if they do any arrangement, it will be with Berlin, Paris, whoever, but not with Brussels as such. Whether it's in the trade war, whether it's in automotive industry, patents, energy problems, whatever. So I see a very gloomy future, a very gloomy immediate future, short run future for Europe. And I wrote a book called Requiem for Europe, which I published last June. I wrote it in German. It was published in Russian, but we are now editing the German version, and it will also be published in Arabic and Chinese and English. So it will be a little bit difficult how to handle the sale, the distribution, because there are no payment possibilities. And I don't want to venture into some sort of very complicated structure. So we will see how the distribution of the book might be done, but it will be available. And it was the first time in my writing life, so to say, as an author, that I had the title for the book from day one. I called it Requiem for Europe. With all my other books, I had the title at the very end. I had a working title, but not a real title. But the fact that I called it Requiem for Europe, I started writing that book under very nasty circumstances in my life in 2022, when I was kicked out from wonderful EU, from the garden. And for about 10 days, I had to live in the street because I was about to move to Lebanon. It was not yet possible. It was a horror time. And to keep me move and to structure this horrible time, I started writing this book. And I called it Requiem for Europe because I had really experienced myself in a very nasty way that Europe had passed away. That was in 2022. And I remember also one talk with somebody from Vienna in 2021 who was actually a Russian Jew living in Vienna. And he asked me, yeah, how do you see this and that, and to move on. And I told him, I left Austria in 2020, and I told him in 5 years it might be too late. And I think I'm not totally wrong with my assessment.
It sounds like some analysts think that the war in Ukraine is not so much about Russia. Of course, it is about Russia, but also it's about bringing down Europe, the European Union as a competitor to Washington, which is what we've seen with the partial deindustrialization. To what extent do you think it's Europe's own fault, whether it's the bureaucrats, the decision makers, maybe the population that's a little bit apathetic?
Well, I don't see the poor European vessels following nasty Washington. I know that this is the perception that is very widespread also here in Russia, but I tell all my Russian counterparts, I personally never had any problem with any US counterpart when I served as minister. Even with Pompeo, I got along. And the people with whom I did not get along, if you want, or who were, I would even use the word sabotaging initiatives, were the people in the European Commission. So there you have a huge bureaucracy, no historical, no political thinking, as I said. It's just this, this certain kind of value system, lines to take, and very sterile, out of touch with reality approach to whatever, Syria, Ukraine, you name it, you have it, Venezuela. And I consider the quagmire as 100% homemade. The German automotive industry has been struggling for 10, 15 years, homemade. Ukraine, to a large extent, homemade. The Minsk agreement could have been handled in a serious way by Berlin and Paris. They didn't care. And they didn't care not because Washington told them not to care. They themselves didn't care. So it's a homemade disaster. And we see now new talk coming out from DC. We heard it, we saw it at least in the Senate hearings by the new National Security Advisor, Mr. Waltz, and others, speaking about the need for larger security arrangements in Europe. So you have some sort of, let's call it diplomatic language in Washington, new language. But when you listen to German politicians, when you listen to Mrs. von der Leyen and Mrs. Callas in Brussels, it's as if Mr. Goebbels were back, It's this very warmongering and let's go to war, let's fight until the last Russian. Russians have to be killed, Russians have to be cancelled. This is what Brussels is like. It's not anymore so much at least from what I hear. I'm neither in Brussels nor in Washington, but I read a lot about them. I can watch all sorts of news here in my little village in the morning. I watch French TV, I watch American TV, US American TV. So I have access to all these things. And I lived long enough inside the EU to, I think, have had a certain idea of what it is about. And I had the chance to live for a very short period in the US. But what I learned during this very short period in the US is that with every administration starts clean slate, year zero. And people can say, well, let's forget about that. It's not our war. Trump says it's up to the Europeans, and they will have to struggle with the mess they themselves created.
Well, that that wasn't the optimistic answer that I thought you would deliver, but it makes total sense. And I think there's a reason why people like Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas are in the positions that they are, because they do represent a particular sentiment that's dominant, perhaps in the European Union, this kind of more warlike sentiment that doesn't seem to be paying off for them right now. Marcelo, do you want to add anything? Because we've been going now for 2 hours, and I want to give you guys a break.
Because I forgot when I start talking the last question, I had one thing in my mind, and that's exactly the transnational relation when you said about this is a very European mentality. And then, yeah, we mentioned the United States, and you just said, oh, this is not exactly Washington. This is also homemade. This is a lot of internal things. And I fully agree with that. We had here Alex Krainer, for example, and he has this all roads lead to London way of thinking. And when I see, for example, the United States, I had a conversation more or less in the same week that we had the conversation with Krainer. I had a conversation with Larry Johnson, where we discussed a little bit of this relation between London and the United States. And when I say London, of course, I also mean Europe, because my conception of the United States, just like Brazil, was not different than the monarchy or the oligarchs from Europe moving out from Europe because that was gone and going to a new place, richer, with more resources and all that. And when I look at the United States, perhaps I've never been there. Perhaps this is a abstract concept that I have. It's very made by it's much more made by the European way of thinking than Brazil, for example. We mixed more with our the Africans that we changed there and the Indians there. We mixed a little more. Plus, the Portuguese has a very peculiar way of thinking concerning the Europeans. Do you think when you say that's my great question? When you say this is a very European way of thinking, it comes to the United States and it kind of comes and goes. It operates like a one unique how can I say it a body, US, Europe, EU, US. They look like they are intrinsically together on that. When you say, for example, yeah, that's not too much Washington, this is European Union sabotaging itself. Can it be a relation, a bilateral relation on these transactions because of this nature of transnational oligarchy that came from Europe, went to United States, and don't care about Europe? Was I clear? I think I was too much away from the question.
Well, when I say it's typically Europe and it's homemade quagmire, it's that the Europeans shouldn't be seen as the innocent victims of bad Washington.
That I 100% agree.
Well, thank you for clarifying that. I think we're going to wrap it up, but let's end it on a positive note. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about your animals? In the previous episode, someone was really upset that I've asked you a question about your dogs, and I was a little bit surprised, thinking, you could scroll through the episode. And so hopefully this upset person is listening to us now. So we're going to talk a little bit more about our dogs before we we wrap it up.
Well, the dogs and cats and ponies, in contrast to me, they can very well speak to their counterparts here, like they could speak in Lebanon or Syria with the other animals. And this is really, it fascinates me again and again that we need to study the language. They can speak in their language, in their barking and meowing. This is amazing. This communication that they can do. And I am simply grateful that I made it with my dogs and ponies over here, especially these two boxer dogs. One is snoring here, my dear Winston. They have seen so much.
Oh, it's so adorable. He's been absorbing all the politics.
Yeah. He was with me in the ministry when he was 6-7 months old.
Wow.
He met Indian foreign ministers, and he met many ambassadors. He was in many boring meetings. And we made it together to France, from France to Lebanon. And these two boxer dogs, really, they often were my reason to continue. And it would have maybe been easier for me to move from France to Russia with 2 suitcases. I could have done it. But it would have been impossible with the dogs. There was already the 3rd sanction package. And I don't know, something might have happened to the dogs. People told me, give them to some good people and you start a new life. I said, never. No, maybe this whole detour to Lebanon and Syria, I did it only for my animals, but I did it. I made my queues there to get residence permits and tax numbers and so on. It was horror. But I did it, and I don't regret that I did it because my animals were always at my side. And I'm not a misanthrope. I like human beings. But from my entire life in Austria, there are only 2 or 3 persons with whom I'm still in some sort of regular.
But I mean, you may be a big fan of people, but this is the first face you see in the morning and the last face you see at night every single day. And you might have great family members and friends, but you don't see them that frequently. And so I can totally understand that deeper connection as a family member, that attachment is to me is much deeper. Your story about meeting ministers reminded me all the funny memes about Putin's dogs and Angela Merkel being afraid of one of his last dogs. I wonder if you have any funny stories about that.
About Angela Merkel and Putin and the dog?
Well, anyone being afraid of your dog, maybe, or being a little bit apprehensive.
No, but the funny thing was that when I had I had the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of India in my office, and I asked him whether he minds if the dogs are in my office. I could also put them in a second room, and he said, no, I myself have many shelter dogs, street dogs. I'm a practicing Hindu. I believe in reincarnation. So I said, Minister, may I introduce you to my boxer dog? His name is Winston Churchill. So he looked at the dog and he said, oh, very interesting. You are Winston Churchill, reincarnated. I'm from independent India.
Probably a much more reasonable and humanitarian version of Winston Churchill than the actual Winston Churchill and his behavior, let's say in the 1940s when it comes to India.
Yeah, good to it. So no, I'm aware. I know many people attacked me. How can I call my dog Winston Churchill, the warmonger and genocider Churchill and so on? Churchill, of course, in today's world, Churchill wouldn't survive 1 month in politics. They would kick him out because he's a smoker, because he's a drinker or whatever, a drunkard, but whatever. Definitely he was a personality. And this dog, when I took him from the dog shelter, I looked at him and I said, you will be Winston Churchill.
You'll look
Because
like a Winston.
yeah, he only misses the cigar, and he is such a dignified gentleman, my dear one. Yeah. When we are talking about you,
He knows. He's tuned in. Well, my most of my previous dogs were named after Russian military leaders, and people always found that interesting as well and a little bit curious. And I always tried to find ones that were a little bit more pan-European. So one of them, unfortunately, we only had him for a few months before he passed away. He was named after the leader Barclay de Tolly, who was, Scottish and this and that, and he was in the Napoleonic War. So I've really tried to to do something kind of similar in this regard up until recently.
There's one anecdote that comes to my mind when I met Mr. Pompeo, the then Secretary of State of Trump. I knew that it would be a harsh meeting. Pompeo is Pompeo. And I asked my colleagues whether Pompeo has a dog. And you can easily Google these things. In the end, I Googled. And yes, he has a dog. And when I met him, I brought a letter where I put, "Dear General Sherman," this is the name of his dog. We do hope that your master will have more time for you for walks. He's very busy and so on. Please find enclosed some treats. Yours, Winston Churchill. So
General Sherman communicating with Winston Churchill is a historic twist that no one could foresee.
yeah, but this enabled us 10, 12, 15 minutes of a more better atmosphere than because otherwise he wanted to talk about Nord Stream 2. I didn't want to talk about Nord Stream 2. It was not my competence. I was not the chief engineer of Nord Stream 2. But so I tried to talk about dogs.
Well, as you said, they have this international language and they can just communicate with other dogs in a different country. So there's something about them bringing people together. Do you speak to them in German, or are you trying to mix languages?
I mix languages a lot, but of course we speak German a lot, but we also speak French. We speak Arabic. And I use German when it has to be serious on purpose. So all the animals understand that when it's German, it's serious.
Which is for me Russian.
Makes
When
sense.
it's Russian, it's serious. For me, it's when it's Russian and it's the full name, it's serious. And if it's English, it's a little bit less serious, which makes sense. What about your horses? Are they also multilingual?
Mm-hmm. They also speak some Arabic and German. And now here it's all about Russian. But they feel at ease. They like it a lot. My ponies are 34 and 25 years old. And a lot of people told me that I should not transport them from St. Petersburg to this place. It was 1,200 kilometers with the trailer because they are too old. I said, they have to come here. They have to be with me here. And they rejuvenated within 3-4 months. Everybody could see how they got better, because St. Petersburg, weather stable, it was all terrible. And here we're living together. We have a wonderful place. So they rejuvenated, and they are the attraction of the village. Lots of children come, and I hope that once the house is renovated and the garden looks like a garden and not like a muddy construction site, the ponies will come for tea to the terrace. That's the way I had it before.
We must have them on the next episode.
Yeah.
Ponies, some boxers, the little King Charles, and we'll have, well, I mean, these animals are obviously know how to bring people together better than current EU politicians. So there's something to be said about that.
Yeah.
It'll be a lesson in diplomacy coming from canines and the horses.
Yeah. I gave you this phrase in our correspondence that das Leben ist kein Ponyhof, this German phrase, which means life is tough. Don't consider it a pony farm. But I always count that, even so I'm very aware of the toughness of life. And I had to go through many hells, but I always say you can turn it into a pony farm, and that's what I do in between. It's against all odds. You can make life a little bit a pony farm.
Well, thank you so much. This was actually much more optimistic, I think, than the the end of our political conversation. And I am serious. I would love to have the two ponies on,
Yeah.
a future podcast for for people to see. They would be probably one of the star attractions. Do you have any final words? I guess it doesn't seem like you know where the books will be published, because I'm sure our audience would love to find maybe
Yeah.
the English and the German versions.
Well, the books will be published by St. Petersburg University Press. How they can be distributed, of course, there will be e-books, but the problem is the payment. So there we are on planet Russia, and maybe we can do it in gold. I don't know.
I am a big proponent of going back. Instead, people are doing Bitcoin, and I'm a proponent of using gold and silver. So we might have to arrange something in this way. But it would be amazing to actually talk to you about your books in more detail when they're available to a broader public and the languages that they can read. So
Yeah,
this is
can do that. We can do that together with the ponies, and then I hope that when there's a better season, not so icy, muddy, whatever, then we can sit on the terrace, and the ponies can join the discussion.
Well, thank you so much for joining us from planet Russia, where I, being a Russian, haven't been in a long time, so I'm a little bit envious. And we would love to have you back, Marcelo.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Kneissl. And remember, everybody, that all the links we're going to put on the description. Hopefully, we can get even a link for the book to buy the book. And we see you guys on the next episode. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Thank you.